In Yosemite National Park, there's a grove of trees. These trees are called the giant sequoia trees, and they're amongst the largest trees in the world. Not the tallest trees, but their trunks are so big you could drive a car right through the middle. Back in the day, we attempted to protect the forest and the giant sequoia trees from fires, and we did so successfully. But in doing so, we realized the giant sequoia trees stopped reproducing and sprouting. You see, because those trees need fire, their bark contains fire-resistant properties that will protect it from moderate fires. The heat from the fires would rise up. The heat causes the cones to open so that the seeds can fall down to the forest floor. The fire comes along and clears all the brush on the forest floor so that the seeds can get in the soil. The heat from the fire punches a hole in the roof of the forest so that the sunlight can shine through. You see, these trees need fire, but if the fire burns too hot for too long, it will devastate the forest, including the giant sequoias. So although these trees need fire, too much of it is devastating. You see, fire can be a necessity. It can help us survive, just like the giant sequoia trees. It could bring warmth and it could bring comfort, but if we get too close, we could get burned. I liken that to anger. You see, we need anger. Anger can help us survive. When there's a threat, when our lives are at risk, we can use anger. But too much anger can be detrimental to our health. So what happens when we get angry is different for each person. I talk real fast, I cuss more, and I trust less. Those are some of the things that happen to me when I get angry. But what happens to us internally when we experience anger? In order to better understand that, we got to take a look at the brain. And for us to do that, I brought along a handy model of the brain that I borrowed from Dr. Dan Siegel, who's a professor of psychiatry at UCLA. Dr. Siegel said that this part of our brain is referred to as the brainstem. And that's the oldest part of our brain, the reptilian brain, 300 million year old part of our brain that's responsible for fight, flight, freeze, or faint mechanism. Our thumb goes across the middle. That's the limbic region. Within the limbic region is the amygdala. Amygdala is the part of the brain that gets activated when we get angry. These four fingers wrap around the top. That's the cortex. This part of the cortex is the prefrontal cortex. That's the part of the brain that's used for complex decision making and regulating our impulses. We reason with that part of the brain. Dr. Dan Siegel says that when the amygdala gets activated because we're angry, it will hijack our brain, causing us to flip our lid, which disconnects us from the prefrontal cortex. You see, because it's not time for us to make complex decisions or reason. It's time for us to fight or flee. I think that sometimes when we're angry, we only flip part of our lid. But I digress. When we go into fight, flight, or freeze, there's an increase in heart rate, blood flow to our extremities, a physiological reaction that will protect us. But what happens when there's no physical threat? Anger could be a useful tool for us to reaffirm boundaries and protect our emotional well-being. There's a lot of things in this world that we have a legitimate reason to be angry about. There's inequalities, injustices, there's oppression, there's macro-level systemic issues, and we can use anger to fuel advocacy to help protect our society. But what happens when we get angry too often? When it becomes our baseline? When we misinterpret the provocation? We think we're being provoked, we think there's a threat, but we're actually misinterpreting it. Or when there's just little things that trigger us too often. Someone drives slow in front of us in the fast lane. We lose our keys and we're going to be late for work. When we're too angry for too long, we're at risk of heart attack, high blood pressure, and stroke. It's not healthy for us. Furthermore, when we flip our lid and disconnect, we become impulsive. We can say or do things that we'll regret. It could affect our relationships. If we let anger take the wheel when we shouldn't, there could be consequences like jail. So anger could be our ally or it could be our foe, depending on the use, severity, and frequency. There are times where we need to regulate it. So how do we do that? Research shows that we can't suppress our anger. Rather, research shows that we need to acknowledge our anger, accept it. We need to turn towards it, sit with it without judgment. If our lives are not at risk, then we slow down. We don't need to act on the feeling. We watch it. We don't manipulate it. We don't judge it. We just watch it. Mindfulness meditation is a powerful tool to help us regulate our anger. Mindfulness is shown to reintegrate part of our brain when it becomes disconnected. When we flip our lid, Mindfulness can reconnect our upstairs brain with our downstairs brain. Furthermore, it strengthens the corpus callosum, which is the fibers that connect our left hemisphere with our right hemisphere. When our brain becomes more integrated and connected, there's more harmony. When there's more harmony, there's more emotional well-being, and it also fosters more creativity. So what is mindfulness? Mindfulness is defined as paying attention to the present moment on purpose, non-judgmentally. So we just rest in the present moment, observing everything exactly the way it is. Our thoughts, our feelings, everything that we're sensing. We don't try to change it, we just watch. Mindfulness is an opportunity for us to check in. They say if you don't check in, then you're gonna check out. And as we go inside and check in, we identify our feelings. They say if you could name it, then you could tame it. Research shows that if you can name the feeling with the left hemisphere, it'll send soothing neurotransmitters down to calm us down. So as we sit with our anger long enough, a lot of times we realize we're not sitting with anger alone. Anger is a surface emotion. Anger is what bubbles to the surface. Underneath are primary emotions such as fear, sadness, and grief. It may be very difficult for some of us to identify with fear and sadness, especially men. We were taught that identifying with fear is a weakness. We were misinformed. As we get older and mature, we realize it's actually a strength to identify and call it as it is. We're going to feel the whole gamut of human emotions. It's a weakness to push those aside, to not acknowledge them. It's a strength to be able to identify our fear. Fear is like the fire. Fear is like the anger. We need it to survive. We don't let it govern our lives, but we don't ignore it either. So to conclude, anger is like the fire with the giant sequoias. We need it. It protects us physically, emotionally, and as a society. We cannot and should not discard it. It could be an ally or it could be a foe, depending. However, we need to be aware of sometimes that we misinterpret the provocation. We can't be angry all the time because it's bad for our physical health. We have to turn towards anger, accept it, acknowledge it, and sit with it. We name it so we can tame it. Not just the anger on the surface, but the underlying emotions too. We deal with the threat so we can return back to a place of peace. Because if we have more peace inside, then we can project more peace outside. Here we go. My mind is racing. There's always something. I can't get a break. Just leave me alone. I can't trust anyone. Let him in. Such a screw up. I'm gonna die. Don't tell him. No one sees me. People don't. They won't understand. I don't think I'm already judged. Not gonna stop. So sad energy. I hate crap. I just want to die. I feel so nervous. Just one more time. I always see something done. Everyone's so incompetent. So alone. I don't believe in it. I just want this to stop. Why am I like this? I'm just so angry. Breathe. 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 Everything's gonna be okay. You're exactly where you're supposed to be. Timber approves this message.